The first time I caught Karen stealing my firewood, I thought I was imagining things. After all, who steals firewood in the middle of winter? But there she was, Mrs. Karen Latimer, president of the Oak Ridge Heights HOA, in her fluffy pink robe and snow boots, dragging one of my neatly stacked oak logs from my shed across the frozen yard toward her pristine patio fire pit. The wind carried the faint creak of her garden cart as she hummed to herself, utterly unbothered by the fact that she was trespassing. That was the moment I knew something had to change. For 2 years, Karen had made my life miserable. I'd moved to Oak Ridge Heights for peace and quiet, a little suburban retreat after 20 years of military contracting and long, sleepless nights. But Karen, with her HOA clipboard and passive-aggressive smiles, had other plans. She fined me for non-compliant mailbox paint. She sent warnings for my improperly trimmed hedges. She even tried to ban my dog, Scout, for excessive barking. But the firewood? That was personal. I chopped that wood myself every fall. I liked the process, the rhythm of the axe, the smell of pine and oak, the satisfaction of stacking each log with care. It was my therapy. And now, this self-appointed queen of cul-de-sacs had decided my firewood was community property. At first, I considered confronting her directly. Then I remembered the last time I did that. It was last summer when she tried to tell me my truck didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic. I told her I'd move it when she stopped parking her SUV across my driveway. She responded by issuing me a parking violation, complete with a fine. I paid it, but I never forgot it. So when I watched her steal that firewood, an idea sparked. Small at first, like an ember in dry grass. What if this time I let her take it? What if she thought she'd gotten away with it again? And what if I made sure she'd never want to steal from me, or anyone else, ever again? The next morning, I started planning. I'm not a violent man. I don't believe in revenge for its own sake, but I do believe in consequences. Karen's type never learns unless something spectacularly backfires, preferably in front of witnesses. So, I got to work. I started by modifying some of my old, hollowed-out logs. When I was in the service, I'd learned a thing or two about controlled detonations. Nothing lethal, mind you, but enough to make an impression. I rigged the hollow logs with a fine powder blend I'd use for signaling charges, loud, bright, and harmless if used properly. Each firewood bomb was perfectly safe unless thrown directly into a roaring flame, and I knew exactly where Karen liked to light haze. Her Friday night neighborhood bonfires were the talk of the street. Wine, gossip, laughter, and plenty of bragging about how some people just don't understand community living. She never invited me, of course, but I could see the firelight from my backyard, flickering like a taunt. I prepared 3 hollow logs, each looking indistinguishable from the rest. Then I stacked them in the same pile as the others, in plain sight near the fence. I even made sure to leave the gate slightly open, a silent invitation. Sure enough, Karen took the bait. That Friday evening, I watched from my window as she crept into my yard again, flashlight in hand. Scout growled low beside me, tail twitching, but I shushed him. Karen struggled with the logs. They were heavier than she expected, and loaded them onto her little cart. She even took a moment to look around, just in case I was watching. I smiled. I was. She wheeled them back across her perfect lawn, humming again, blissfully unaware that she'd just hauled her own humiliation home. The following night, the neighborhood gathered for Karen's winter warm-up bash. I didn't go, of course, but I made sure to sit on my back porch with a cold beer and a perfect view of her fire pit. Her backyard glowed with fairy lights. Guests milled about with mulled wine and hors d'oeuvres, chatting under a canopy of stars. Karen, in her white fur coat and designer boots, basked in the attention. Then she threw the first log onto the fire. There was a moment, just a breath, when everything seemed still. The wood hissed, cracked, and then came the pop. A burst of light shot skyward like a miniature firework. The guests screamed and stumbled backward, drink spilling. Someone yelled, "Is it supposed to do that?" Karen blinked, startled but trying to play it off. "It's, special wood," she stammered. "Imported." The laughter was nervous, unsure. She threw in another. This one exploded louder, sending a shower of sparks across the patio. Someone's scarf caught an ember, and the man slapped it out with a shout. Karen's face drained of color. "Okay, everyone, let's move away from the fire." Too late. The third log went off like a cannon. The blast was harmless, but loud enough to rattle windows up and down the street. Smoke billowed. The guests screamed and scattered, knocking over chairs and spilling their drinks. Someone called 911. From my porch, I could barely contain my laughter. Scout barked wildly, tail wagging. When the fire department arrived, Karen was frantic, waving her hands and shouting about sabotage. But when the firefighters examined the remains, they found nothing dangerous, just charred wood and residue from old, harmless signal powder. One of them said, "Looks like your logs had some kind of firework material in them. You sure you didn't buy these online?" Karen gawked at him. I didn't buy them. They weren't." She stopped short, realizing what she'd almost confessed. The firefighter prompted. Karen forced a laugh. "Must have been a mix-up," she muttered. The neighbors whispered, watching her squirm. Over the next week, the story spread like wildfire, no pun intended. Every conversation at the mailbox, every HOA meeting, every morning jog was about Karen's exploding fire pit. She tried to regain control of the narrative, of course. She blamed faulty wood suppliers and malicious pranks. But no one bought it. Her credibility, once ironclad, began to crumble, and I enjoyed the piece. For the first time in 2 years, no one left me passive-aggressive notes about my lawn. No fines appeared in my mailbox. Karen avoided me completely, pretending not to see me whenever our paths crossed. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, how long would it last? People like Karen don't change. They adapt. They lick their wounds, find new targets, and rebuild their thrones of control. And I could see it in her eyes, that simmering, hateful glare she'd give me from across the street. I'd embarrass her. Publicly. Utterly. And Karen Latimer didn't forgive or forget. That was fine. Neither did I. Because as satisfying as that little explosion had been, it wasn't enough. Not yet. I started noticing strange things around my property again. The trash bins mysteriously knocked over. My mail arriving late or not at all. Even a warning notice from the HOA claiming my yard lights violated community brightness standards. Her fingerprints were all over it. So I decided, if Karen wanted a war, I'd give her one. But this time, I wouldn't just embarrass her. I'd destroy her, with her own rules, her own arrogance, and her own precious HOA. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud and fiery. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and beautifully devastating. And as I sat by my freshly stacked pile of real firewood, sipping coffee in the cold morning air, I asked myself one question, the kind that makes you grin even before you know the answer. How do you make a tyrant like Karen burn without ever striking a match? When Karen's faux pas became the neighborhood's favorite story, I could have folded my arms and let karma carry her. That would have been the tidy, satisfying ending most people crave, the bully humiliated and life returning to normal. But two things kept me awake that week, the small acts of harassment that followed, and the stubborn certainty that Karen would rebuild. Humiliation was a scar. I wanted structural damage. So I switched tactics. If laughter and fireworks had rattled her authority, then a methodical, by-the-book dismantling would make the house of cards come down quietly, legally, and with everyone watching. No more theatrics. This time I would win in paperwork, meetings, and public opinion. Tools a true HOA queen respects more than anything. First, I did what Karen feared most. I made the neighborhood talk in a different language. Facts and evidence. I started building a record, not of melodrama, but of mundane, undeniable infractions. The trash bins knocked over. I set up a simple motion-activated camera on my back fence and let it film. The missing mail. I started logging dates and saving emails. The yard lights notice. I pulled out the HOA bylaws and read them front to back until the words blurred. I learned the arcane rituals of our small government, how votes were counted, how meetings were called, what quorum meant. It turns out the most powerful club in the cul-de-sac hid inside 3 binders at Mrs. DeVal's house. 2 weeks into my quiet evidence gathering, something delicious happened. While reviewing my videos one evening, I noticed a familiar silhouette crossing my yard at 2:17 a.m. The shape was unmistakably Karen. Headlamp, coat, those ridiculous snow boots. The clip showed her riffling through my pile, loading logs onto her cart. She paused, looked toward my house, then glanced around as if practiced in the art of surreptitious theft. The camera caught the cart rattling away down the path. I exported the file. I could have used the footage to shame her publicly at the next HOA potluck. Instead, I took it to the one person who could weaponize it the right way, Mrs. Duval, our HOA secretary, and a woman who took minutes with the piety of a medieval scribe. Her eyes widened when she saw the clip. Her fingers trembled as she typed an email. Records, she said. This would go into the files. She promised to add it to the agenda for the next HOA board meeting. From there, it was chess. I quietly reached out to neighbors I'd only ever passed by in the cul-de-sac nod, the retired teacher with binoculars, the couple with a kid who ran a YouTube channel on community gardening, the mail carrier who always seemed friendlier to me than to Karen. One by one, they handed me pieces. Mrs. Lee, who lived diagonally across, produced grainy footage from her doorbell camera showing Karen skulking by my shed at odd hours. Mr. Patel, the mail carrier, admitted he'd noticed my mail missing and had suspected misrouting, not malice. He agreed to provide a written statement. Little threads, stitched into a pattern. Meanwhile, I noticed Karen's behavior growing clumsier. Humiliation makes people rash. She began calling emergency services for trivial things. A suspicious person who turned out to be a delivery driver, an unsafe fence that just needed paint. She mailed out admonitions en masse, accusing everyone but herself of infractions. The neighbors, at first amused, started to bristle. Her pile of petty grievances grew so large it made the monthly newsletter read like a litany of spite. At the emergency HOA board review, the one Mrs. Duval scheduled once she had my footage and supporting statements, I did something I hadn't planned. I didn't storm the podium. I didn't deliver a dramatic monologue. Instead, I stood in the back, a quiet man with a flash drive in his pocket and a stack of printouts in his hand. Karen sat at the head of the room, face the color of cream cheese, clutching her clipboard like a talisman. Her smile was gone. She had no armor except procedure, and even that was tarnished. The board chair, an elderly man named Jefferson who'd once been a judge, called a meeting to order. The first item, allegations of misconduct by HOA President Karen Latimer. Someone snorted. Someone else coughed. I let the silence linger. Jefferson asked for a statement. I stepped forward. I'm not here to be poetic, I said, voice low. I'm here to show you evidence. I handed the flash drive to the secretary, who connected it to the big screen projector with a small, satisfied smile. The grainy night footage played. The room stayed quiet as neighbors watched their self-appointed protectors sneak through someone else's property. Gasps punctured the silence. Karen's face tightened until it looked like a fist. I presented the rest, timestamps, email logs, statement from the mail carrier neighbors, even a copy of the firefighter's report from the exploding logs incident, which, if read calmly, suggested the presence of pyrotechnic residue on burned wood, not illegal circumstances, but enough to show inconsistency in her claims about suppliers. I did not accuse. I asked questions the HOA had to answer. Had Karen declared her conflict of interest? Had she followed procurement rules? Had she misused a position to fine or intimidate neighbors selectively? The binder-carrying, bylaw-obsessed secretary nodded as she checked boxes and dates. When the floor opened, the neighbors spoke. Mr. Harris recounted receiving a fine after he complained about how Karen blocked his view during the neighborhood 4th of July. A young mother spoke about a threatening letter she'd received for improperly placed children's toys. The stories, once isolated irritants, connected into a pattern: abuse of authority, selective enforcement, and retaliation. Karen tried to defend herself. She spoke of duty and standards, of maintaining property values. But every time she used the word standards, someone else held up a cardboard stack of minutes showing a different standard applied to them. Her defenses began to sound rehearsed, then brittle. Finally, Jefferson, patient, judicial, and tired of petty tyranny, read from the bylaws. There were clauses about ethics, disclosure, and a president's duty to the community. There were procedures for censure and removal. Less than an hour later, the board voted. It was not a dramatic execution of power. It was a procedural, merciless thing. Votes cast, minutes recorded, a recall motion passed under the letter of their own rules. Karen asked for more meetings. She threatened lawsuits. She cried, publicly, and then privately, when the neighbors' sympathy ran out and was replaced by something colder, relief. The recall was only the beginning. With the HOA watching, the county inspector revisited the safety complaints Karen had used as levers. Permits she'd claimed were in order were not. The contractor she'd favored for aesthetic improvements had been paid irregularly. Small administrative irregularities accreted into formal investigations. An ethics review flagged conflicts of interest. The more they looked, the more it became clear her power had been a veneer glossed over greed and pettiness. Karen tried to fight back with the only weapon she had left, rumor and fear. She posted flyers, made calls, suggested the neighborhood had been taken over by a saboteur. But the more she shouted, the quieter the room became. Neighbors answered with other voices. The mail carrier signed statement, the doorbell footage, the minute showing her own misuse of authority. The narrative had changed, and not in her favor. When Karen finally left Oak Ridge Heights, she moved to be closer to family, she told a realtor with a practiced sigh. The street felt different. It wasn't a carnival of victory. It was a slow normalization of justice. Mrs. Duval's minute became a small museum of how power can be accountable, that even petty tyrants bow to procedure when the community holds up a mirror. Me? I didn't throw myself a parade. I fixed my gate, thanked the neighbors whom I bothered with emails and late-night phone calls, and resumed chopping wood. People came over more often now, bringing cider and stories, not because I had become a hero, but because the neighborhood had rebalanced. Scout got more walks. The mailbox stopped being a place of dread. I thought about the fireworks evenings sometimes, the way the sky had flared and the way Karen had faltered under the sudden, ridiculous light of a prank she started. That was small theater, a burst that startled and then faded. The real victory had been quiet, procedural, boring, the kind of victory tyrants never imagined because it looks like paperwork instead of triumph. Yet it was more permanent. A month after Karen left, the HOA chair sent out an email detailing new transparency measures, conflict of interest disclosures, better recording of fines, and a new clause for camera evidence to be admissible in meetings. There was even a community vote to create a small fund for neighborhood events, a page torn out of the old woman's rulebook but handed to everyone now. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit on my porch with a cup of something warm and watch the street. The string lights glowed over hedges now trimmed by neighbors who trimmed together, not under threats. Kids built snow forts where people once whispered about standards. A new president took office, softer-spoken, less theatrical, who actually listened. When she thanked the community for vigilance at her first meeting, the applause felt like an ovation not for a savior but for a neighborhood that had learned to be its own guardrail. I kept 3 of the hollow logs out of nostalgia, burned on private, safe bonfire nights that smelled of pine and memory. I never admitted to anyone that I'd been its architect. The secret, like any good story, was more potent unspoken. Karen's downfall had been composed of many small acts, not one giant blaze. Revenge, I discovered, isn't always about fire. Sometimes it's about patient construction, about turning someone's tools against them, not with violence, but with validation. It's about transforming embarrassment into accountability and spectacle into lasting change. And if Karen ever wondered why the neighborhood no longer danced at her command, she had only to look at the minutes, the camera footage, and the new bylaws, the invisible architecture that had reformed the tyrant into a cautionary tale. The last I heard, she lived in a townhouse 2 towns over, micromanaging a smaller HOA with fewer stakes. Maybe she's learning the hard way that people remember. Maybe she isn't. Either way, when I lay wood on my own fire, the flames now warm the whole street, and they do it without anyone stealing what's meant to be ours.